Your son, the lawyer, how is he? Some letters I found in my sister's belongings. I need advice from someone I can trust. Can't you just help me on the side?
There is no on the side. This is a full-time job.
Oh, how can you see out of those glasses? Filthy. Here she is, my aunt, Adela, painted by Gustav Klimt.
It's quite a painting.
She was taken off the walls of our home by the Nazis. And since then, she's been hanging in the Belvedere Gallery in Vienna.
And now you'd like to be reunited.
Wouldn't that be lovely? And then there's justice.
You really think a painting that ends up as a fridge magnet will ever leave Austria?
It'd be a mistake not to take a look.
Could you drive a little faster?
We're gonna be there 4 hours early.
But I want to buy perfume and cognac in duty-free.
I never thought I'd come back. That's our home on my wedding night. Half of Vienna was here.
Mrs. Altman, welcome to Vienna.
They're going to put as many obstacles in your way as possible.
We were gonna try and find a copy of your aunt's will. Could have searched for the file on my own, you know.
I wasn't going to miss all the fun. This is like a James Bond film, and you're Sean Connery.
The painting belongs to Mrs. Altman's family.
She is the Mona Lisa of Austria.
We will fight you till the end for something we believe is ours.
They destroyed my family. They killed my friends, and they forced me to abandon the people and the places that I loved. I won't let them humiliate me again.
Here to file a lawsuit. We're taking the Austrian government to court. Have a nice day.
There's no way you're gonna win.
We didn't come here to eat cake. All along, you have thwarted me and closed the doors in my face.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a moment in history.
Once the past has been put to right, we will not have come here in vain. People see a masterpiece by one of Austria's finest artists. But I see a picture of my aunt, a woman who used to talk to me about life. We should be reunited with what is rightfully ours. Andy, can't you drive a little faster? Look, the chocolate on your donut is melting.
Hello there, Richard the Film Geek here, and I'm here to give you guys my review of the 2015 biographical drama Woman in Gold, which was written by Alexi K. Campbell, was directed by Simon Curtis, who previously directed My Week with Marilyn, and has since given us Goodbye Christopher Robin, as well as the last two Downton Abbey movies, A New Era and the grand finale, and stars Helen Mirren, Deadpool himself, Ryan Reynolds, Daniel Bruhl, Tatiana Maslany, Katie Holmes, Max Irons, the actor son of Jeremy Irons, Charles Dance, Elizabeth McGovern, aka Countess Cora Crawley of Grantham herself from Downton Abbey, and Jonathan Pryce. The story of Woman in Gold is based on the true life story of an octogenarian Jewish refugee named Maria Altman, played by Helen Mirren, who, whilst living in Los Angeles during the late 1990s and early 2000s, teamed up with a young, up-and-coming, inexperienced but determined American lawyer named Randy Schoenberg, played by Ryan Reynolds, on a decade-long legal campaign going all the way to the US Supreme Court against the Austrian government over ownership of several family heirloom paintings, one of which in particular being the titular iconic Gustav Klimt painting, otherwise known by its full name, Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I, that were ransacked and stolen during the Anschluss. Anschluss being, of course, the illegal annexation of Austria by the Nazis just prior to World War II. So now that I've recently seen this movie for the first time, here are my thoughts on Woman in Gold. Especially coming from someone who admittedly wasn't initially familiar with this particular story until fairly recently, at least in preparation for this review. While I wouldn't exactly go as far to say that this is a terrible film, because I've seen quite a few movies this year that are almost certainly, definitely far worse. To say that I was still left kind of unfortunately underwhelmed by this one would be quite the sad understatement, to say the very least. This isn't just one of the most disappointing movies of 2015 in one's honest opinion, but it is also probably the most disappointingly beige, boring, and kind of emotionally manipulative movie I have recently seen, particularly since Ladies in Lavender last year. And it especially incredibly sucks and is such a shame for me to say this, because I am such a sucker for World War II movies, courtroom dramas, and of course character dramas. And yet even I can see that the potential was there for this movie, and this quietly inspirational and heroic story in particular of how Maria Altman managed to survive the Nazi shadow enveloping her hometown at the time, and then ultimately took the Austrian government to task, held them accountable, and forced them to confront their own dark past, to have all the right ingredients and just be much better executed than it was. But somehow, at least in my view, this movie just failed to live up to that potential or even do anything with it. Left me feeling nothing but silent boredom throughout the entire runtime, perhaps apart from a few stifled chuckles here and there. And thus I genuinely do believe this story deserved a much better treatment than it was given here. One honestly kind of has to sympathise with everyone involved for the most part, because clearly you can tell that everyone here really tried their hardest, and or at least really made as much effort as they can to make something close to a semi-decent product here. But their talents are just being hindered and undermined, not just by the gross interferences from the certain grubby, dirty and scummy pig of a co-producer that is Harvey Weinstein. Yes, that Harvey Weinstein. But also by this shockingly lazy script, which, by the way, I will get into a bit later. Look, now, the question you're probably asking is there at least anything I remotely liked about the film? Well, the American and Viennese locations are nice. The costumes are gorgeously designed, and I really like the beautiful score here by Martin Phipps and Hans Zimmer. I will also legitimately say that the flashback sequences set during the 1920s and 30s that take up only half of the movie are remotely more moving, compelling, engaging and interesting than the rest of the movie that takes place in the relatively modern day, even despite giving us nothing revelatory or new that we probably didn't already know from countless documentaries about how horrifically the Jews were treated by the Nazis during World War II, and especially the Holocaust. When it comes to the performances, they're a mixed bag, to say the least. Elizabeth McGovern, Max Irons, Charles Dance, and even Jonathan Pryce, two actors that have both appeared in The Crown, by the way, as Lord Mountbatten and Prince Philip, respectively. Kind of random that I almost forgot about that. They're just there, really, in rather thankless, insubstantial cameos or bit roles. Katie Holmes, aka Rachel Dawes from Batman Begins, also doesn't really get that much to work with here, and is thus, frankly, kind of wasted. I mean, for example, there is one scene within the 60-minute mark of this movie where she's about to go into labour while he is rehearsing for the next stage of the case, and she just passively and nonchalantly tells him that her waters just broke, with this rather oddly bored, awkward and disinterested look on her face, as if she really didn't want to be there. Daniel Bruhl gives another fine performance as this Austrian investigative journalist who ends up befriending Helen Mirren and Ryan Reynolds and helps them gather evidence for their case as a way of atoning for the sins of his father, who himself was a Nazi, and thus thankfully has a marginally much better character arc here than I feel he did in Ladies in Lavender. The only two performances I will remotely legit say are surprising standouts in this movie, which isn't really saying much, are Tatiana Maslany as the young Maria and Ryan Reynolds as Randy Schoenberg. Tatiana Maslany does such an impressive enough job of conveying all the pained anguish and grief and emotional turmoil that Maria goes through during the flashback sequences that you'd almost wish her story could have benefited from just a couple more of these flashbacks. And I also really wish we could have seen a bit more of her than we did. In the case of Ryan Reynolds, while I do of course understand where people would take issue with his slight miscasting and portrayal of Randy Schoenberg, I for one thought he gave a not necessarily great, but good enough and much more subdued and low-key dramatic performance here. Especially obviously granted that he isn't as characteristically quippy, sarcastic or bombastic as he will most definitely have a chance to show the following year with the first Deadpool. Helen Mirren does try the very best she can here, bless her. She does confidently prove herself, as she usually does, to be right up there with the cream of the crop of great British acting talent still working today. And I guess her chemistry with Ryan Reynolds is okay at best. But at the same time, she just feels oddly miscast in this role. I just honestly don't know where she got the idea to do this Austrian accent that is so bizarrely dodgy and jarring it would make Schwarzenegger himself cringe. Or even especially these more bizarre, more distracting, cartoonishly black contact lenses that make her look like she's been ripped straight out of one of the Charlie Brown Peanuts cartoons. Nor does it really help that her characterization in this movie is just weirdly and frustratingly inconsistent. One moment she is all fired up and determined to see her case through and get her painting back, and the next moment she just gives up easily and doesn't really seem to care who gets the painting. And honestly, this constant changing of her mind happens probably 2 or 3 times in the movie, and it frankly grows old and tedious rather quickly. It is almost as if Alexi K. Campbell somehow couldn't be bothered to create a compelling or interesting internal conflict for this character. Not to mention the fact that she feels much more like a secondary or supporting character in her own story. Very much in a similar way, for example, to Dumbo being sidelined in his own story in favour of the boring, uninteresting human characters in the 2019 live-action Dumbo remake. Speaking of which, that perfectly leads me to talking about the script, frankly being the first major problem I have with this movie. This is Anglo-Greek playwright Alexi K. Campbell's very first, and so far only, major Hollywood screenplay. And yet somehow, aside from the obvious globe-trotting, it appears to only look and feel like a stage play in and of itself when you watch the movie. Far too wordy, nothing really much happening in terms of action. Characters talking in only one specific location in every single scene. And even the camera work and the editing perfectly reflects all of that. The second major problem I have with this movie, rather paradoxically, is with the flashback sequences. Now, don't get me wrong, they are emotionally riveting and moving in all the right places. And of course I do understand what the filmmakers were trying to go for here, which was basically implement a similar non-linear storytelling device to what Francis Ford Coppola iconically used, for example, in Godfather Part 2. But alas, it just doesn't quite work as well here, unfortunately. Because not only do they slow the movie down a bit and grind the pacing to a halt, and not only do they lack any real tension, suspense, or stakes, as they very easily should have done, but there just simply isn't enough of them for the story to make any narrative sense whatsoever. And they also almost completely skim over Maria's entire backstory. We are only briefly told how her aunt died really young in 1925 from meningitis. Yet we're not even really shown or told what happened to her parents and her sister, what happened to her uncle. Were her extended family persecuted and exterminated by the Nazis during the Holocaust? Or even what happened to her husband, or whether or not they possibly had children, or grandchildren, or great-grandchildren. There is just so much exposition and backstory missing here that you just end up losing any potential emotional investment you could have otherwise had in this story and this particular case, which is kind of a shame, really. Plus, more to the point, I really have to take issue with this film's portrayal of the Austrian government officials as stereotypical moustache-twirling pantomime villains. On the one hand, you do sort of understand, at least from their point of view, why they were aggressively reluctant to relinquish this painting, because of how much this painting became part of their national identity since after World War II, to the point of earning the moniker the Mona Lisa of Austria. But on the other hand, in actuality, they only obtained the painting through the most illicit and criminal means known to man. And they were just as much unfortunate blind victims of the Nazis' criminality and manipulation/propaganda tactics as Germany was at that time. And thus I feel they needed to be portrayed with some nuance and complexity and a shade of grey about them. The third major problem I have with this movie is Simon Curtis's direction. And yet, at the same time, I refuse to believe that directly this is his fault. Look, don't get me wrong, I think Simon Curtis, when he needs to, can be a fine director. And I absolutely, legitimately dug what he did, especially with My Week with Marilyn, and even the two-part 1999 BBC TV movie adaptation of David Copperfield. But sadly, I'm not going to lie when I say that his work here just seems too uncharacteristically workmanlike and in a way committee-driven. Again, not his fault. He is trying at least the best he possibly can. But sadly, like everything else in this film, the Weinsteins just truly, grossly undermined and did him dirty here. In fact, speaking of those two grubby, disgusting and scummy pieces of devil spawn actually, that leads me to briefly talking about the fourth and final major problem I have with this movie. That the whole thing just smacks of yet another project that doesn't look in any way cinematic whatsoever, and instead has the general look, feel, and aesthetic of a TV movie that somehow just happened to be picked up by the Weinsteins, retooled and repackaged as this typically over-pretentious piece of Oscar bait that desperately tries to capitalize on and copy, beat for beat, the exact same emotional themes and story beats as the much, much superior Philomena with Judi Dench and Steve Coogan, and only given a theatrical release in order for it to somehow qualify for award season. Because especially as far as the oh-so Academy Award obsessed Weinsteins are concerned, why the fuck not? And to think that this movie came out a couple years before the Weinsteins' deserved rapid unraveling and downfall as a studio, largely thanks to the hashtag #MeToo movement back in 2017. In conclusion, there is honestly nothing really that much else for me to say about Woman in Gold, other than it is yet another film that I really wanted to like, especially because of the subject matter and the time period. But alas, I was left for the most part crushingly disappointed and let down. However, I will remotely take this over something like Ladies in Lavender if I at least had to choose between the two movies. Which, honestly, again, isn't really saying much. If you happen to like this movie more than I do, more power to you, I guess. If you happen to dislike this movie more than I do, that's perfectly fine too. I guess I can only recommend this film if you want to see the Queen and Deadpool globe-trotting together in a decent-looking film, and also even if you're someone who, like yours truly, is into true stories, or World War II history, or courtroom dramas, or even character dramas. Otherwise, I'm afraid you're just going to be as crushingly disappointed as I was. And with all that being said, there's really no other overall rating for me to give Woman in Gold than a rather hesitant 4.5 out of 10. Don't forget to do the following few things as always. Leave a comment below, let me know your thoughts on Woman in Gold, subscribe to my channel, click on the little bell to receive any emailed notifications and or updates from the channel. If you haven't already, you can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Blue Sky. Do take care, everyone, and bye-bye.